Welcome to another episode of Denden's Global Politics, where each week I'll be bringing you short lessons aligned directly with the Global Politics Unit 3 and 4 curriculum to ensure that you have the best chances of success in the exam and in life. This lesson will continue with Unit 3, Area of Study 1, which focuses on global actors, and begin examining the next global actor in the roster, the International Monetary Fund, otherwise known as IMF. Today, we'll be looking at three things. We'll be looking first at the history of the IMF, second, at the aims and roles of the IMF, and third, we'll be evaluating the power of the IMF. First, let's go through a little bit of background on the IMF. Just a little bit of background. The IMF, like the UN, was part of the global reconstruction effort that followed World War II. But while the United Nations was designed to foster political stability and promote international cooperation, the International Monetary Fund was designed to foster economic stability and foster economic cooperation. The IMF, together with its cousin, the World Bank, is often known as one of the Bretton Woods institutions, which takes its name from an international finance and monetary cooperation conference which occurred at a little hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire.
At Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, delegates from 44 allied and associate countries arrived for the opening of the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference.
Boring. The conference sounds so nerdy as to make the attendance at this computer hardware convention seem like the backup dancers to Mark Ronson and Beyonce at the Super Bowl halftime show. It's an interesting quirk of the IMF that states are given votes based on the contributions they make to the IMF, which means the European states and the United States alone represent 49% of the entire voting share of the IMF, which I guess is a pretty even distribution considering 49% of the world is Western. Since its birth, the IMF has changed and grown over time. Most importantly, in the 1970s, the IMF found itself taking an increasingly active role helping poorer states who found themselves in spiraling amounts of debt. Notably, none of these were Western states who had the most say in how and where money was spent by the IMF. By the 1980s, the IMF had developed a loan program called the Structural Adjustment Facility, followed up by a version 2.0 called the Enhanced Structural Adjustment Facility. The most bland and innocuous sounding names for one of the most crucially important loan program propagated by the IMF. Here's how the structural adjustments worked. State A falls into debt. The IMF gives a loan to State A, but then attaches conditions to the loan, which often require significant restructuring of the debtor state's economy in line with IMF advice. These changes constitute a structural adjustment to that state's economy, hence the term Structural Adjustment Facility. But do I hear you ask, what do these changes involve? Well, I'm glad you asked. The conditions mainly include things like reducing government spending, privatizing government-owned services like railway lines or airlines, reducing trade barriers to allow for cheaper imports from other countries, and reducing or removing subsidies from local industries or services which may be threatened by global competitors. Indeed, the IMF's process of actually arriving at the conditions it attaches to its loans is the international equivalent of Queer Eye for a Straight Guy, whereby a group of IMF economists, most usually from the United States and Europe, fly into the collapsing country, hang around in a nice little hotel for a few weeks, interview some stakeholders, look at the government's books, tell the government what it needs to do, and then fly right the f*** out again.
You came into my life, and my world never looked so bright. Yeah, it's true. You bring out the best in me when you are around. When you are around, all things just keep getting better. Keep getting better.
The ultimate irony is these structural adjustment programs, more often than not, tend to make things worse. Most recently, the IMF has been actively involved in trying to mend Greece's economy alongside the European Union and the European Central Bank. In many ways, the 2008 collapse of the Greek economy was a long time coming. The government had been wallowing in debt for a long time prior to 2008 due to a range of things, such as systemic tax evasion which occurs in Greece, a hugely generous and unsustainable pension system, and other debts it's run up over time, including those for the 2004 Greek Olympics. But after the global financial crisis of 2008, it all came to a head and Greece's problem went very public. The European Union, fearing that Greece's collapse would lead to a destabilization of the euro currency, began trying to bail Greece out. Eventually, they asked for the IMF to come come in and assist. By the end of 2014, the IMF, the European Union, the European Central Bank, and a range of other states had together given Greece 320 billion euros in loans. 24 billion of that alone came from the IMF. Despite the fact that Greece is obviously in no position to pay these loans off, it already couldn't pay off its debt. How could $320 billion more debt have helped?
How are you gonna get out of here?
We'll dig our way out.
Now, dig up, stupid.
And it hasn't helped because most of these loans have been used by Greece to pay off other lenders, and very little of the money has actually seen its way into being invested into the Greek economy. This, on top of the conditions that have been set for Greece in return for the loan, such as privatizing public industries, cutting government spending, has actually left Greece worse off than it was at the beginning of the crisis, with general unemployment at 23% and debts that now equal 180% of GDP. What? You can't pay that off. To its credit, the IMF, in its infinite wisdom, has begun calling for debt relief for Greece, suggesting that more loans probably won't help. More importantly is how flagrantly irresponsible the IMF has been, given that it knew Greece probably wouldn't be able to pay off the debts before it started lending to Greece. So let's look at the takeaway for the IMF. The IMF is both extremely powerful and profoundly influential over states. States suffering economic crises find themselves with nowhere left to go to stave off political and social crisis and end up going to the IMF. States do have the option to say no to the IMF, but the risk that entails often tends to stop them short. Even in Greece, when a new government was elected in promising to stop implementing the bailout terms, it ended up finding itself with no choice but to implement the bailout terms. The lesson here is the planet turns on money. If you want to have influence, get rich.